I step onto the dock at midnight, the fog thick and heavy, clinging to my clothes like a warning. Ships loom out of the darkness, their hulls groaning under the weight of secrets no one dares speak aloud. The air is sharp with brine, and something sweeter, something deadly. A faint, perfumed smoke drifts from an alley nearby, curling around me, tugging me forward. I follow it, heart pounding, and see men hunched over pipes, eyes glazed as if the world has stopped existing outside their mouths. I feel the warmth creeping into my chest, slow, seductive, like a tide pulling me under. Each inhale is a surrender I can't resist, each exhale another thread in a web tightening around the city around me. I glance at the bustling streets, the markets, the palaces, and realize it's not just the poor who are lost. Kings, merchants, priests, entire empires, they all fall asleep under the same haze. And I can feel the noose tightening, and the world teeters on the edge of ruin. The smoke of history still hangs heavy, and its secrets are waiting. Subscribe before it slips away into darkness. The morning came soft over the plains of Mesopotamia, turning the reeds and barley to gold. A hush hung above the earth, broken only by the rustle of wind through the stalks and the hum of insects still drunk on the night's cool air. Beyond the riverbanks, where the soil ran dark and damp, a different crop had taken root. Tall stems crowned with pale, trembling blooms. The first light struck them, and for an instant they looked alive, their petals glistening as though dew had turned to tears. The people who tended these fields didn't know they were staring at the beginning of a curse. They called it Hul Gil, the joy plant. When the stalks were cut, a milky sap bled from their wounds. The workers collected it carefully with blades of bone, smearing it onto flat stones to dry. By nightfall, the resin hardened into something that shimmered in the lamplight, soft brown, sticky, almost holy. The priests said it came from the gods themselves, a balm for pain and sleeplessness. It quieted the cries of the sick, the wailing of the dying, and the groans of women in childbirth. In every corner of the ancient world, from Sumer to Thebes, that promise spread sleep without dreams, peace without consequence. But the peace was a lie. The first dose was always mercy. The second was always need. The line between the two vanished before anyone could see it. What began as a medicine soon became a devotion. The rich burned it in gold bowls and called it communion. The poor licked it from their fingers and called it deliverance. No one noticed that it stole something with every use, the color from the eyes, the light from the mind, the will from the spirit. In the temples of Nippur and offerings of opium were left beside jars of oil and grain. The priests didn't yet understand that they were feeding a god that asked for more than worship, it demanded surrender. When the traders came, the poppy followed them. It hitched rides in clay jars along the Tigris and Euphrates, across the sand and salt of Arabia, to the markets of Egypt, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat and spice. The Egyptians mixed it with wine and honey, calling it the drink of forgetfulness. Pharaohs carried it to the tomb, their bodies embalmed beside the same narcotic that had eased their mortal pain. And still, no one feared it. How could they? The poppy grew in sunlight, and its sap smelled sweet. What harm could come from something so beautiful? By the time it reached the Aegean, the Greeks were calling it the tears of Hypnos. They painted the god of sleep holding poppies in his hands, their seeds spilling like sand from an hourglass. The same hands that brought rest also carried ruin. Beneath the myth, the truth was already stirring, a truth that would outlive every empire that tried to control it. And as the sun dipped, behind the ziggurats, the fields glowed crimson one last time before night fell. The farmers packed their harvest, the priests whispered blessings, and the sap cooled in the dark. The world was learning, slowly, to trade pain for oblivion. The flower dreamed on, and humanity dreamed with it, never realizing it would one day forget how to wake. Night in Thebes carried the scent of resin and river water. Inside a small stone chamber, the air shimmered with candlelight, flickering across walls carved with prayers to gods who ruled over pain and rest. A physician ground the hardened tears of the poppy into powder, mixing it with honey and crushed lotus. His patient, a wounded soldier trembling on the table, breathed heavily through clenched teeth. Outside, the city murmured, the Nile moving slow and endless beneath the moon. Inside, silence pressed close as the man swallowed the draught. Within minutes, his eyes softened, his body went slack, and his breathing slowed into the rhythm of something deeper than sleep. The priests who watched called it mercy. The healer bowed his head, whispering thanks to the gods of both life and death. They believed this sleep was sacred, a bridge between the two worlds, a glimpse of eternity without the finality of the tomb. The draught was powerful, divine even, yet the man on the table did not dream. His pulse fluttered, and the candle beside him flickered as though feeding on his breath. In that stillness, the first sleep of Opium began, a peace too perfect to trust. Word of the miracle spread faster than the floods. From palace courtyards to village huts, people began seeking that same sleep. The old called it healing, the young called it joy, the merchants called it fortune. Every vial sold in the markets came wrapped in the same promise: a night without suffering, a day without fear. But the powder carried something else within it, something no one could yet name. The first to notice were the physicians themselves. Patients returned again and again, weaker each time, their eyes clouded, their hearts restless when the medicine ran out. What had begun as a cure was becoming a hunger. In the temples, priests mixed the poppy's sap with wine for their sacred rituals. The worshippers drifted into bliss, whispering that the gods spoke through the smoke. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps the divine had found a new voice, soft, seductive, and patient. Each breath drawn from the clay pipes carried more than comfort. It carried surrender. At night, as the city slept under its own enchantment, the river kept moving. Boats drifted along the current, their cargo sealed in earthen jars. Inside them, the dried sap waited, silent as a secret. It would travel far beyond Egypt, to the islands of the Aegean, to the palaces of Crete, to the ports of Phoenicia. Everywhere it went, it would promise sleep. Everywhere it went, it would leave dependence. The soldier who had once lain trembling beneath the healer's hands never fought again. They said the gods had blessed him with peace. But those who found him in his home years later spoke of a man half awake, half dreaming, always chasing the warmth of that first night. In the city of Thebes, under a sun that glowed like copper, the people called the poppy's gift divine. They hadn't yet learned that some dreams never let you wake. The Aegean dawn shimmered like molten bronze on the water, and in the port of Knossos, the air was thick with spice and the tang of salt. From the decks of Minoan ships came amphorae sealed with wax, each bearing the faint scent of something more intoxicating than the wine inside. The sailors called it mekonion, a gift from the gods of sleep. When they traded it across the islands, they said it could quiet a storm inside the human mind. In the marble villas above the port, Greek physicians experimented with the strange brown resin that came from the eastern lands. They boiled it in oil, mixed it with vinegar, and stored it in jars marked with the symbols of Hypnos, the god who slept with a crown of poppies on his head. The poets loved the myth that Hypnos brushed his flowers over the eyes of the restless and carried them into the dream world on the edge of Lethe. They wrote that even Zeus himself could not resist that gentle power, but those who drank the draught soon found that it demanded obedience, not worship. In Athens, the philosophers debated the nature of pleasure and pain, while servants slipped opium tinctures into the cups of noblemen too weary to think. The line between reason and rapture blurred. Some swore they could feel the gods whispering through their veins. Others said they glimpsed a darkness deeper than the sea. Every dose promised rest, but it also unstitched the will, thread by thread. What began as philosophy ended as silence. By twilight, the smoke rose from doorways like incense, curling over the alleys where the poor sought the same deliverance their masters could afford in gold. They had no temples, no hymns, only the pipe and the promise that came with it. And when they fell into that heavy sleep, the city itself seemed to exhale, 1,000 bodies lying still under the same narcotic moon. Athens dreamed of immortality. It had found instead the illusion of escape. Ships from Egypt and Crete carried more of the poppy's resin each season, and the traders grew rich. In the flickering lamplight of the symposium halls, the laughter grew slower, the talk softer. Men nodded mid-sentence, drifting into the easy nothingness the flower provided. It was a new kind of devotion, a worship without prayer, a peace without virtue. One physician, a quiet man named Demarchos, began to write his doubts in the margins of his medical scrolls. It dulls the pain, he noted, but it dulls the soul as well. No one read his warnings. By then, even the healers were dosing themselves before sleep. Far beyond the city, the poppy fields bloomed again in the east, their white crowns glistening under the sunday. The wind carried their pollen like a benediction over lands that had yet to fall under their spell. Every petal trembled as if waiting for harvest, and in their silence lay a prophecy. The gods had given humanity rest, but not without a price. The night fires of Rome flickered against marble and iron, throwing long shadows down the narrow streets. The empire never truly slept, but it dreamed dreams perfumed with smoke from the eastern ports. Along the Tiber, merchant ships unloaded crates sealed with the wax of Alexandria and the scent of Egypt's fields. Inside them lay the dust that conquered pain itself. Rome called it opium somniferum, the sleep-bringer. It was medicine, luxury, and sin bound together in a single breath. In the apothecaries of the Subura, physicians in crimson robes mixed the dried sap with wine and myrrh, selling it to senators and soldiers alike. For the rich, it softened the exhaustion of politics and indulgence. For the poor, it dulled the pain of labor and hunger. Every class found its comfort in the same resin. The empire's pulse slowed, lulled by the illusion of peace that came in a vial. At banquets, goblets clinked as laughter grew heavy and strange. The patricians reclined on couches beneath painted ceilings, their pupils wide, their limbs languid. The poets, those beautiful doomed men, praised the poppy in verse, saying it gave the soul wings. But the truth was heavier. Many never woke from their dreams. The servants would find them hours later, their lips pale, their cups still full. Rome, so proud of its order, had discovered chaos that needed no army. In the infirmaries of the legions, medics pressed the powder into the mouths of the wounded. It worked miracles. It stopped screams, erased pain, made the dying serene. Commanders wrote home to their wives, praising the substance that made war tolerable. No one asked what became of the soldiers who survived, the men who returned hollow-eyed, shaking, unable to rest without the taste of the flower on their tongues. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor-philosopher himself was rumored to take the tincture before sleep. His writings spoke of endurance, reason, control, yet beneath those words was fatigue, the quiet despair of a man who ruled too much and felt too little. Opium gave him calm. It also gave him distance from the living. The empire that had once ruled with discipline now floated in a haze of its own making. In the brothels and bathhouses, in the libraries and villas, the same ritual unfolded: a pinch of powder, a sigh, a soft descent into nothing. The gods of Rome had multiplied beyond counting, but none were worshipped more faithfully than the god of forgetting. Even the priests of Asclepius, healers sworn to preserve life, began burning poppy resin in their temples. They said it pleased the divine. Perhaps it did. And still the ships kept coming, more crates, more sap, more sleep. The empire's veins were open, and the world poured through them. When the night finally fell over Rome for good, no trumpet sounded, no enemy breached the walls. The fall began quietly, with the sweet smell of poppy smoke drifting above the 7 hills. As an empire of steel drifted gently into its own dream, the Silk Road did not shimmer with silk alone. Beneath the scent of spice and the jingle of camel bells, another trade wound its way across the deserts, a darker current moving from the west toward the rising Sunday. The poppy's resin, once the secret of empires, now traveled in clay jars packed with wool and incense, its value whispered between merchants, who called it the dream dust. Along that road of caravans and ambition, pain became a commodity. In the markets of Bactria and Persia, traders poured the powder into scales worn smooth by years of deceit. Gold weighed lighter than opium there. It was said that a handful of the stuff could buy a horse, a slave, even silence. The desert winds carried its scent into temples, tents, and palaces, into every place men sought to dull the ache of living. From healer to addict, the transformation was seamless. Those who bought it for medicine returned for more, not for cure, but for comfort. The priests of Zoroaster warned that such sleep belonged to the lie, that the flower was a trickster born of shadow. Yet even they could not deny its miracles. It eased fever, quieted madness, stilled pain that had no other remedy. In the apothecaries of Persepolis, the poppy's sap was ground with saffron and stored beside the sacred oils. Its label marked a gift of compassion. The word spread further east, carried by nomads who understood trade better than scripture. In the oases where Persia kissed India, caravans met ships bound for the ports of the Indus. Sailors spoke of a new hunger awakening in the kingdoms beyond the mountains of rulers, curious about this strange resin from the west that could soften grief and sharpen dreams. The priests of the Indus Valley had long burned soma in their rituals, seeking divine ecstasy through smoke and chant. When the poppy arrived, it found a home waiting for it. On warm nights, under the red glow of oil lamps, the resin melted into water and was shared among the weary. They said it brought visions of goddesses walking through fields of flame, of ancestors speaking through mist. But the visions grew longer, the sleep deeper. Merchants delayed their journeys, musicians forgot their songs, and some never woke at all. The road became a corridor of twilight. From Antioch to Samarkand, from the Oxus to the Indus, the flower's dust trailed behind armies and pilgrims alike. It did not conquer cities, it settled inside them. Long after the caravans moved on, the people they met would lie down at night and dream the same dream, the one that promised warmth and mercy and peace. No empire claimed the trade, it claimed them instead. By the time the first Chinese merchants heard rumors of the Western sleep, the poppy had already crossed mountains and oceans unseen. Its roots were spreading quietly beneath the world's foundations, turning gold into ashes, mercy into dependence, and every road eastward into a road home for oblivion. The dawn mist hung over the Yangtze like a pale veil, softening the outline of junks drifting toward the southern ports. From the west came merchants with polished chests carved from teak and bound in brass, each one carrying a secret that smelled faintly of incense and honey. The poppy had reached China. It arrived not as a conqueror but as a guest, offered humbly to the Middle Kingdom as a medicine fit for emperors. The court physicians called it yingsu, the sleeping herb, a balm said to still pain and summon peace. In the halls of the Tang Palace, where music floated through silk curtains and the air shimmered with sandalwood smoke, the first pipes were lit. The emperor's favored concubine, known for her fragile health, inhaled the sweet fumes through a porcelain stem. Her sigh filled the chamber, light as prayer. By evening, word spread that the foreign medicine had restored her strength and eased her melancholy. The courtiers applauded. The empire had found serenity in a flower from beyond the western mountains. But serenity has a shadow. As the years passed, the pipes burned longer into the night. Eunuchs and officials gathered in secret rooms, the scent of poppy smoke winding through the corridors of power. The same resin that stilled pain began to still ambition. Records from the imperial archives spoke of ministers who slept through their duties, poets who forgot their verses mid-recital, and soldiers who returned from campaign unable to lift a blade without it. The emperors themselves were divided. Some banned the herb outright, calling it a foreign corruption. Others defended it, praising its power to quiet the heart. In the provinces, it slipped through the hands of traders and scholars, priests and peasants alike. Opium became a secret companion to every level of society, a medicine for the body, an escape for the soul. Along the rivers, tea houses began offering more than tea. The smell of jasmine mingled with something heavier, darker. Patrons sat for hours, their eyes half open, their laughter slow and strange. Poets wrote of drifting through golden fields, of hearing the gods whisper from beyond the clouds. The scholars debated whether such dreams were glimpses of paradise or illusions born of decay. And still the poppies bloomed, cultivated now in hidden gardens across the empire. The same red petals that once crowned the fields of Mesopotamia now swayed under the gaze of Chinese moons. Farmers learned to score their pods just before dawn, collecting the sap that oozed like white tears. In the cool of morning, it hardened to brown, ready for trade. By the end of the Song dynasty, the herb of healing had become the companion of exhaustion. China's heart beat slower, lulled by its own cure. What began as a gift to the throne had descended to the streets, and in every wisp of smoke lay the same fragile promise that forgetting was easier than enduring. The emperor's herb had taken root, and beneath its quiet beauty, an empire had begun to dream. The sun over Bengal was merciless white, blinding, and without pity. Beneath it, thousands of laborers bent low in the fields, their bare feet sinking into cracked soil. The air shimmered with heat, the kind that made time itself feel slow. Between rows of rice and sugarcane, the poppy plants stood tall, their round green pods swelling with sap that gleamed faintly in the light. They were beautiful, almost tender, but beauty here had become a weapon. This was no longer a healer's crop, it was an empire's investment. The East India Company had discovered that peace could be harvested. British agents in linen coats rode through the villages, ledger books tucked under their arms, recording quotas and debts. Each farmer was told how much poppy he must grow and how little food. They called it commerce. The locals called it starvation. When the season ended, the company's officers would collect the sap, boil it down to resin, and press it into bricks bound for Canton and beyond. The profits flowed west, the suffering stayed behind. In Calcutta's warehouses, the air was thick with the sweet, choking scent of opium curing in the Sunday. Guards watched over the stacks as clerks counted the blocks, stamping each one with the insignia of the crown. The British saw no contradiction between morality and trade. After all, they were selling medicine, not misery. It soothes the Orient, one official wrote to London, and stabilizes our interests. No one asked what it did to the souls it soothed. Across the river, in the shanties of the workers, the men who tended the poppy fields sat in silence. Their hands were stained white from the sap, their wages already promised to next year's tax. Some chewed the hardened resin to forget hunger, others burned it to sleep through the night. The empire's wealth was built on their oblivion, and the flower they nurtured now consumed them first. At the docks, crates of the narcotic bricks were loaded onto ships bound for the portent, China. The crews called them black gold. The British Crown called it commerce. But to the priests who watched from the riverbanks, the sight of those ships sailing eastward felt like a curse renewed. They said the Ganges itself wept that day, carrying whispers of ash and betrayal toward the sea. By the time the ships vanished beyond the horizon, Bengal's fields lay stripped and hollow. Where rice once grew, poppies shimmered under the fading light. The farmers knew what came next: famine. The same empire that had promised prosperity had stolen their harvest and sold their hunger abroad. As night fell, the wind carried the faint scent of opium across the plains, sweet, distant, haunting. In London, lamps would burn brighter for the profits made that season. In Bengal, the stars shone over empty granaries and restless dreams. The colonial seed had been planted, and its roots were already spreading deep into the heart of the world. Dawn broke over Bengal like a bruised violet at the edges, red in the middle, slow to fade. From the banks of the Ganges, a mist rolled across the land, curling low around the poppy fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. The flowers glistened with dew, their petals pale as bone, their pods swollen and heavy with the resin that now fed the world's hungriest empire. To the company men, this was wealth incarnate. To those who worked the soil, it was bondage that grew back every spring. The farmers rose before the light, barefoot, silent, moving in lines between the rows. They carried short blades carved from bone or broken metal. With a practiced motion, each man scored the poppy pod's thin cuts just deep enough to bleed the sap. By midday, the white latex would ooze and darken, congealing into the sticky brown gold that the company prized above all. Women followed behind with baskets, scraping the resin into small lumps and wrapping them in leaves. Children carried the baskets home, their fingers sticky and sweet with poison. In the towns, British officials recorded the harvest with the precision of accountants, not farmers. They wore pith helmets and white coats already grey with dust, their ledgers heavy with numbers, acres, yield, taxes, debts. They called it progress. They told Parliament it was a triumph of commerce and civilization. But the villagers had another name for it, the season of hunger. Each acre devoted to poppy meant an acre lost to rice or grain. Each harvest meant another winter of empty bowls. The company's factories near Patna and Ghazipur were cathedrals of profit. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of boiling sap. Men stirred massive cauldrons, reducing the raw resin into dense, tar-like bricks. Each was stamped with an emblem, a lion, a crown, a promise. Soldiers guarded the storerooms while clerks counted crates marked for Canton. Outside, ox carts lined the road, loaded with blocks of addiction bound for the docks. The smell clung to everything, the walls, the workers, the very wind. When night came, the fields lay quiet again, but not at peace. In the huts beyond them, mothers pressed rice water to their children's lips, trying to still the cries of hunger. Some burned tiny bits of opium to calm them. It worked. Too well. The next day, the same mothers lined up at the company outpost to trade their last grain for another scrap of the drug. And so it went crop after crop, debt after debt, until the land itself seemed weary of growing anything but despair. In London, merchants toasted to record profits. Ships docked at Thames wharves gleamed with the wealth of Bengal's misery. No one there smelled the rot beneath the sugar and spice, or the faint sweetness of opium that clung to the empire's silks. But the wind over Bengal still carried it the scent of loss, of surrender, of dreams harvested and sold by men who never dreamed at all. The fields swayed softly in the dark, whispering to the stars like mourners reciting a prayer the gods had long stopped hearing. The South China Sea glittered under a blinding sun, but the harbour of Canton was already drowning in haze. The smoke came not from factories or gunfire, but from pipes, thousands of them. From the narrow alleys by the Pearl River to the merchant houses along 13 Factory Street, the scent of opium drifted through the air, like perfume from another world. The British ships anchored offshore gleamed like silver mirages, their hulls heavy with the resin pressed in Bengal's heat. They called it trade. The Chinese called it ruin. Each morning the foreign merchants in linen suits gathered in the counting houses, sipping tea paid for in poison. Ledgers lay open on mahogany desks, inked with the arithmetic of empire. Chests imported, silver extracted, profit secured. Beyond the tall windows, Chinese laborers unloaded crates stamped with the mark of the East India Company, a lion rampant, guarding its fortune. The officers smiled as they signed the manifests, unaware or unwilling to see that every brick carried another heartbeat from Bengal, another life from Canton. In the opium dens along the river, the world looked different. The rooms were dim, the walls painted with smoke. Men reclined on wooden platforms, their eyes half closed, pipes balanced between their fingers like sacred instruments. The first inhalation was always gentle, like falling into silk. The second was deeper. By the third, the mind was far away, drifting through endless corridors of color and memory. The dream was warm, the waking was cold. Officials tried to stop it. Decrees were written, punishments declared. But corruption ran thicker than law. Every ban opened another loophole. Every crackdown created a richer smuggler. The more the empire resisted, the more it craved. Chinese merchants, once forbidden to trade directly with foreigners, now risked everything to join the business. A single chest of Bengal opium could buy a lifetime of comfort or a death sentence. It was a gamble too many took. On the riverbanks, the farmers of Guangdong began to plant poppies of their own, pale imitations of the empire's crop. The soil yielded enough to feed an addiction, but not enough to feed a nation. Across the empire, silver drained like lifeblood from China's treasury, flowing westward into the coffers of Britain. A country once called the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, now paid tribute in smoke. By night, the harbor lights shimmered on the water, reflections bending in the opium haze. The ships waited silently offshore, their decks patrolled by men who no longer questioned what they carried. The crates were sealed and marked, the contracts signed in ink and denial. Somewhere in the city, another den opened its doors, another lamp was lit, another pipe filled. The river ran black under the moon. Each ripple carried the same secret truth. The poison had already won. Canton slept beneath its veil of smoke, dreaming a dream it could not wake from, one imported, priced, and paid for in the quiet language of empire. The harbor at Canton never slept. By dawn, the ship's masts already bristled against the sky, forests of rigging swaying above the water like the ribs of some great animal. Beneath them, small boats ferried crates between east and west, boxes of leaves and boxes of dreams. To one side, British officers tallied their cargo of tea, weighing out the fortune of an island empire. To the other, Chinese brokers inspected the chestnut bricks of opium that had bought it. Every breath of wind carried their bargain smoke for tea, oblivion for serenity. For centuries, tea had been China's pride, its green and black leaves as precious as silver. In London, it poured into porcelain cups and Parliament alike, the ritual of empire made domestic. But as the British thirst grew, their silver vanished, rivers of coin flowing eastward until the treasury began to panic. The solution came not from diplomacy but deceit. Opium would replace silver, addiction would replace trade. What could not be won by gun or prayer would be purchased by despair. At first, the exchange was subtle. British merchants quietly sold opium through intermediaries, feigning ignorance as the chests disappeared upriver. By the 1822, the lie had become an industry. The opium fleets sailed under the Union Jack by day, unloaded by candlelight at night. From the counting houses of Calcutta to the drawing rooms of London, the profits gleamed. Tea returned to England by the ton, fragrant, elegant, steeped in ruin. In the tea houses of London, ladies in lace and men in waistcoats sipped their cups with reverence, unaware that each leaf had been traded for another life. The porcelain rattled softly on saucers as carriages passed, their drivers never imagining that the empire's morning comfort was paid for in another empire's decay. The taste was delicate, floral, the aftertaste, blood. Meanwhile, in Canton, the balance of power tilted with every chest unloaded. The imperial treasury bled silver, faster than it could count it. Soldiers went unpaid, famine crept inland. In the palaces of Beijing, ministers whispered of decline but spoke too late. Smoke had entered the bloodstream of the nation. British officials in Hong Kong toasted their success with imported brandy, watching from balconies as Chinese junks drifted through the haze. A fair exchange, they called it, trade between equals. But even the night air carried contradiction. The sweetness of tea leaves and the acrid bite of opium locked forever in one breath. When the monsoon rains came, the rivers swelled and burst their banks, washing opium residue into the soil. Farmers said the earth itself had grown strange, crops withered faster, insects thrived, and the air smelled faintly of rot. Yet the tea harvest remained abundant, as though nature itself had taken sides. And so the world turned, one empire drinking the other to death. Tea poured into cups across the west while smoke curled into lungs across the east, the two halves of a single ritual. Each sip and each breath bound together in commerce, in craving, in quiet complicity. The sea carried it all. glittering under a sun that no longer distinguished guilt from glory. The forbidden city lay quiet under a grey Beijing sky, its red walls dulled by dust, its courtyards echoing with a stillness that felt too heavy to be peace. Once, this had been the heart of the world, the pulse of the Middle Kingdom, confident in its order, its rituals, its divine mandate. But now, the pulse had slowed. The dragon throne sat above a nation drifting into sleep. In the outer provinces, the opium smoke thickened like mist over the fields. Officials sent reports sealed in wax provinces unproductive, soldiers unfit, silver vanished from the treasuries. The emperor's ministers gathered in the hall of supreme harmony, reciting figures that sounded more like confessions. One spoke of villages where farmers sold their children for a handful of resin, another of soldiers who collapsed mid-drill, pipe still clutched in hand. No one raised their voice. They all knew the truth. The empire was dissolving, not in war or rebellion, but in quiet surrender. In the south, Canton's harbours still pulsed with foreign ships, their flags bright against the haze. The merchants there made fortunes in silver that once belonged to the imperial coffers. Each crate of opium unloaded meant another stream of silver coins flowing back to London. The balance of the world had inverted. China, once the center of trade, was now its debtor. The mandate of heaven, that ancient belief that heaven blessed just rule, began to sound less like faith and more like a memory. The Emperor Daoguang, haunted by what his forefathers had built, walked the marble terraces of his palace at dawn, his robes trailing through mist. He forbade opium, decreed death for those who sold it, exile for those who smoked. But the decrees were words carved into water. His own courtiers hid pipes in their sleeves. His generals received shipments through the back gates of their compounds. The corruption was absolute, the sleep too deep. In the streets of Beijing, beggars slept beside the walls of the imperial city, their breath slow and shallow, eyes glazed with smoke. Temples, once filled with incense, now smelled faintly of the poppy's sweetness. The priests said it was the scent of mercy. The people said it was the scent of decay. One scholar wrote in his journal, "Our empire is not conquered by armies, but by forgetfulness." He was right. The enemy had no face, no banner. It came in ships disguised as trade and entered the lungs disguised as comfort. By night, the lights of the palace flickered like dying stars. The emperor dreamed of battles never fought, victories never won. Outside his walls, the empire's roads were lined with sleepers, peasants, merchants, soldiers, each lost in the same narcotic peace. The dragon that had ruled for centuries was not slain, but sedated. The mandate of heaven still hung above the empire, but heaven itself seemed to have turned its face away, leaving China to drift through its own dream of smoke and silence. In the spring of 1839, the Pearl River ran dark and swollen, its waters carrying more than silt. British ships sat anchored just beyond the harbor, their flags unmoving in the still air, their holds packed with the empire's most profitable poison. Canton stank of opium, the smoke rising from the alleys, the scent lingering even in the courtyards of officials sworn to ban it. And then a single man arrived, bearing the weight of an emperor's final hope. His name was Lin Zexu. He came without pomp, dressed in plain robes, his face calm and severe. Lin was no ordinary bureaucrat. He was a Confucian idealist in an age that no longer believed in ideals. A man who saw law not as power, but as duty. The Emperor Daoguang had chosen him not for his ambition, but for his incorruptibility. And as Lin walked through the city's gates, the crowd fell silent. Here was the man who would challenge the storm. He began not with soldiers, but with letters. To the British merchants, he wrote with courtesy and warning. His message was both plea and accusation. You bring poison to our shores. You profit from the death of our people. Would you permit such a trade in your own land? The letter was addressed to Queen Victoria herself, a moral challenge sent across oceans. It would never be answered. When diplomacy failed, Lin turned to action. He ordered the confiscation of every chest of opium in Canton. Troops surrounded the warehouses, seizing over 20,000 chests, enough to drug an empire for years. The British merchants protested, threatened, bribed. Lin refused them all. "If it destroys your profit," he told them, "then perhaps it will restore your conscience." The confiscated opium was taken to the coast, where trenches had been dug beneath the watch of thousands. For 23 days, laborers poured the resin into the pits, mixing it with lime and salt water until the air itself turned bitter. The sea turned brown, then grey, as if recoiling from what had been done to it. When the last chest was emptied, Lin raised his hand, and the tide came in, washing the poison away. It was not just an act of defiance, it was a ritual cleansing a nation's attempt to wake from its long sleep. But far from Canton, in London's counting houses and Parliament halls, the reaction was swift and cold. The East India Company screamed of injustice, of violated trade rights. Politicians spoke of honor, but meant profit. Within months, warships were dispatched across the seas, their cannons polished, their decks lined with red coats. As the fleet sailed east, Lin Zexu stood by the river and watched the horizon darken. He had done what honor demanded, but honor could not stop iron. Behind him, the people burned incense and prayed that heaven would favor righteousness. But the smoke that rose from their offerings was thin and weak against the storm, approaching a storm that would not cleanse, but consume. The first British warship appeared out of the morning mist, like a shadow given form. Its iron hull gleamed wetly under the sun. Its guns pointed toward the Chinese coast with the indifference of a machine. Behind it came dozens more black ships bearing red flags, their decks alive with soldiers who had never seen the empire they were about to humble. The year was 1840, and the air above the South China Sea was thick with gunpowder and arrogance. Commissioner Lin had written of morality, but morality was no match for commerce. The British Empire did not send replies, it sent artillery. When the first shells struck the coastal batteries at Chuenpi, the noise rolled across the water like thunder from a god that no longer cared who prayed to it. Chinese junks splintered beneath the barrage, their sails burning before they could even turn to flee. Smoke swallowed the horizon. The Qing soldiers fought with courage, but courage could not pierce iron. Their cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the enemy ships, while British shells tore through wooden hulls and human ranks alike. For centuries, China had believed itself untouchable, the center of the world, shielded by divine order. Now, the sea itself betrayed that illusion, carrying foreign fire straight into its heart. In Canton, the people watched the bombardment from the rooftops. They had heard of war before, but not like this, not with the thunder of Western cannon echoing through the river valleys, not with the scent of burning opium mingling with blood. Mothers clutched their children as the sky darkened with ash. The merchants, who had once whispered about silver and profit, now whispered about survival. The British called it a limited engagement, a phrase that sounded civilized enough for Parliament, but monstrous to those beneath the bombs. Their goal was simple: reopen the trade, enforce the treaties, and remind the East that free markets could be maintained by force. Every explosion was a signature, every village burned an article of policy. Lin Zexu, stripped of his command after the first defeats, sent a final memorial to the emperor before being recalled north. "We have angered heaven," he wrote, "by allowing greed to rule where virtue should have reigned." His warnings went unanswered. The court debated while cities burned. By the time the imperial messengers arrived with new orders, the British were already sailing north toward the Yangtze, their path littered with shattered ships and surrendering ports. When the guns finally fell silent, the silence was worse than the noise. The smoke drifted inland, curling around temples and schools, carrying with it the scent of defeat. China, the sleeping giant, had been shaken awake but too late. Its walls of pride had cracked, and through those cracks flowed something far colder than opium: humiliation. The cannons had answered Commissioner Lin's plea for justice, not with words, but with fire. And as the ships turned toward Nanjing, their holds full of new treaties waiting to be signed, the empire that once called itself eternal began to understand the cost of forgetting how to fight. The war ended not with triumph, but with ink. In the humid summer of 1842, aboard a British warship anchored near the city of Nanjing, officials from two worlds faced one another across a polished table. On one side sat the emissaries of Queen Victoria, dressed in crisp uniforms, their hands steady as they arranged documents that would redraw the map of Asia. On the other sat the representatives of the Qing dynasty scholars, in heavy silk robes, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. The cannons outside had fallen silent, but the sound of chains remained. The Treaty of Nanking was the first of its kind, but it would not be the last. Its words were dressed in diplomacy, but written in conquest. China would pay a vast indemnity, 21 million silver dollars, to the empire that had poisoned it. 5 ports would be opened to foreign trade, their harbors handed to merchants who spoke of freedom and meant monopoly. British subjects in those ports would no longer be bound by Chinese law, living instead under their own, an island of impunity inside a wounded nation. And then there was Hong Kong, a small wind-beaten island at the edge of the Pearl River Delta. The British negotiators barely concealed their satisfaction as they claimed it in perpetuity. To them it was merely a foothold, a safe harbor for trade. To history, it would become the symbol of a century's humiliation. When the signatures dried, the Chinese officials bowed and withdrew. No banners waved, no bells rang. It was not victory or peace, only pause, the quiet between wars. News of the treaty reached Beijing like the echo of a distant disaster. The emperor's ministers read its clauses in disbelief. The Son of Heaven had signed away not just land and money, but sovereignty itself. Foreign merchants now walked where imperial law once ruled. Missionaries followed, carrying not just scripture but influence. In the treaty ports, British clubs rose beside Chinese temples, and the Union Jack fluttered over streets once reserved for mandarins. Canton became a city divided. Along its riverfront stood the foreign factories, solid, square, and guarded, while beyond them stretched a labyrinth of Chinese alleys where the defeated tried to carry on. The opium trade, far from diminishing, exploded. With legal access to new ports, British traders poured in more of the drug than ever before. The same ships that had carried cannon now carried crates of resin, and the empire, already weakened, inhaled its own downfall. In the emperor's court, silence hardened into shame. Scholars who had once debated poetry now debated survival. Some turned to reform, others to resignation. The old certainty that China was the center of the world crumbled into dust. The Treaty of Nanking had done more than end a war. It had opened a door that would never close again. Outside, the Pearl River glimmered in the fading sun, its waters reflecting the pale blue of a sky that seemed suddenly foreign. Along its banks, the smoke still rose, curling gently toward the heavens, as if carrying a single question to the gods above. How does a civilization wake once it has learned to sleep? By the middle of the 19th century, China was no longer a nation at war, it was a nation adrift in smoke. From the crowded docks of Canton to the distant villages of Sichuan, the poppy's ghost ruled more faithfully than any emperor. Its breath curled through every street and farmhouse, softening pain, erasing hunger, numbing rebellion. They called it Yang Yan, foreign smoke, and it drifted across the empire like a second sky. In the treaty ports, British merchants grew fat on the trade they had forced open. The opium ships came in daily now, their holds packed with resin from Bengal, their flags bright against the haze that hid their purpose. Inside the foreign factories, the ledgers gleamed with profit, chests sold, silver received, debts collected. The foreigners toasted to free trade, unaware or uncaring that every coin they earned had been purchased with another man's silence. Within the cities, the dens multiplied like tombs. Behind red doors and paper screens, men and women lay in rows upon low couches, pipes between their fingers, the lamplight trembling on their faces. The first breath was bliss, a soft descent into warmth. The second, surrender. By the third, the body floated somewhere between life and death, as if the soul were already rehearsing its departure. Poets wrote of it as a journey inward, a place where dreams could last forever. But the dreams were thieves. They took more than they gave. Officials tried to hide their use behind ceremony, burning poppy resin in ornate braziers during evening meditations. Scholars called it inspiration, courtesans, medicine. In truth, no one called it what it was: enslavement. The same mandarins who outlawed the drug by day inhaled it by night. The emperor's decrees became whispers, his authority, smoke. In the countryside, the addiction spread faster than famine. Farmers, unable to afford food, planted poppies instead, their fields bleeding white latex in the dawn. The local magistrates taxed it heavily, but took their share before sending the rest to the traders. Whole provinces turned from grain to resin, their people living on borrowed strength. The harvest was steady, the hunger constant. Missionaries arriving from Europe wrote home of what they saw: bodies sleeping in the streets, children born with the hollow eyes of their parents. The Chinese nation, one wrote, has entered a dream from which it may never wake. Yet even they began to wonder if the dream was contagious. By the 1850s, half the empire's silver was gone, drained into British banks. Armies faltered, merchants fled, and temples once bright with incense now smelled faintly of opium smoke. The great empire of the Middle Kingdom had become an empire of sleepwalkers. At night, the rivers shone black and still. The water reflected neither the stars nor the moon, only the faint red glow from the dens along the shore. China, ancient and vast, no longer dreamed of heaven's favor, only of one more breath, one more pipe, one more hour before the dawn returned and found it still asleep. The spring of 1856 arrived with gunboats on the horizon. The Pearl River Delta, once heavy only with mist, now shimmered with iron. China's humiliation had already been written once in cannon fire, but Britain had found new cause to reopen the wound. The merchants claimed the Qing had violated treaty rights. The real reason was simpler: profit had slowed, and the Empire of Smoke demanded more. It began with a single ship, a small Chinese vessel called the Arrow. Flying a British flag it no longer had the right to bear. When Qing officials boarded it and arrested its crew for piracy, the British consul demanded their release. The emperor's men hesitated, not knowing that the hesitation itself would be turned into war. Gunfire soon followed. The West would later call it the Second Opium War, but in China it was remembered only as the war that deepened the shame. The British returned with allies now. France joined the campaign, claiming the murder of a missionary as pretext, but seeking the same prize: access, control, and silver. Together their fleets bombarded Canton, the shells bursting over roofs and temples until the city glowed red against the river. The foreign forces moved like a tide, unstoppable and methodical, their discipline sharpened by greed. Chinese soldiers fought with valor, wielding outdated muskets against steel rifles, but valor burns quickly when met with iron. In Beijing, the Emperor Xianfeng received news of defeat after defeat. He sent urgent orders to negotiate, but each offer came too late. The invaders pressed north, capturing city after city, until even the ancient gates of the capital trembled. By 1860, the Allied armies reached the outskirts of Beijing and encamped near the Summer Palace, that glittering monument of jade and gold, built as a retreat for emperors. Its pavilions, once filled with poets and song, would soon burn. The British and French looted the palace with methodical cruelty, stripping its treasures for transport across the sea. Priceless scrolls, silk tapestries, jeweled statues, the symbols of 1,000 years of refinement, were carried off in carts and crates. When there was nothing left to steal, they set it ablaze. Flames devoured the roofs and danced along the carved dragons, turning the empire's beauty into ash. The new treaty that followed was even harsher than the first. More ports were opened, more indemnities demanded, and the opium trade, once illegal, at least in name, was now fully sanctioned. China, once the teacher of the East, had become its market. The Empire of Smoke had finally been legitimized by law, As the foreign soldiers withdrew, the ashes of the summer palace drifted across the city, settling on roofs, rivers, and graves. In them lay the memory of a world undone not by invasion alone, but by desire, denial, and the faint, lingering scent of a flower that had once promised peace. The cannons fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was the silence of surrender. When the guns quieted, the ships did not stop coming. They brought traders still, and soldiers, but now they also carried priests and doctors, men with crosses on their chests and science in their hands. The missionaries arrived speaking of salvation, their words softened by compassion and translated by opium-funded interpreters. In the shattered provinces, where war and addiction had hollowed the people, they found eager converts to both medicine and faith. But sometimes the medicine spoke louder than the gospel. In the treaty ports, the missionary hospitals rose beside the foreign churches, small stone sanctuaries of antiseptic and scripture. There, European doctors prepared mixtures they swore were divine in purpose. One in particular, distilled in glass and light, promised to preserve life itself. It was called morphine, the spirit of the poppy purified. They said it had no curse, no addiction, only mercy. For a time, that lie shone brighter than any sermon. In the wards of Shanghai, pale smoke drifted above the beds as nurses in starched uniforms administered the new cure. It dulled the agony of wounded soldiers and silenced the cries of mothers dying in childbirth. Patients whispered blessings. Doctors recorded miracles. The priests called it proof of providence that the West had come not to conquer, but to heal. But beyond the hospital walls, the dens still glowed, their pipes filled not with salvation but with the same sleep the missionaries condemned. The missionaries tried to preach abstinence in the morning and dispensed morphine in the evening. They could not see that their medicine was merely the old poison dressed in sanctity. And the people, desperate for comfort, trusted both the doctors and the drug. Those who could not afford the hospitals sought to make their own cure, heating opium paste in backyard pots, straining it through rags until it gleamed like amber. They called it white medicine. The priests called it blasphemy. As the 2 peaceful 19th century deepened, morphine traveled farther west into Europe's own veins. Veterans of empire returned home bearing more than medals. They brought the habit with them. Soldiers from the Crimean War, and later from the fields of France, wrote in their diaries of God's sleep in a vial. In drawing rooms, polite society took the new elixir to quiet nerves and steady hands. The same empire that had drowned China in smoke now inhaled its own reflection. In China, the missionaries began to notice that their congregations thinned, their hospitals filled with the same faces again and again. Patients came for healing but stayed for the sleep. The line between faith and forgetting blurred until neither could stand on its own. By the turn of the century, morphine had found its place beside the Bible, on the missionary's desk, one for the soul, one for the body. But in the candlelight, both looked the same, and somewhere far away, in the poppy fields of Bengal and Anatolia, the flowers kept blooming, their petals trembling gently in the wind, as if remembering the sound of distant prayers. The year was 1853 when a German doctor named Alexander Wood pressed a hollow needle through the skin of his wife's arm and delivered medicine directly into her veins. The invention was elegant, efficient, and unstoppable. The syringe promised precision where the pipe offered chaos, control where smoke meant surrender. It was hailed as progress, clean, clinical, modern. Yet in its mirrored steel glint lay the same dream the world had been chasing since Mesopotamia: painless sleep. By the late 19th century, morphine flowed freely through glass ampoules and brass-tipped syringes. Armies carried them in leather kits beside their rifles. Hospitals called them miracles. The drug that had drifted as smoke through temples and opium dens now coursed invisibly through the bloodstream of civilization. The wars of the old world had burned cities, but this war, silent, medical, respectable, would burn inward. In Europe, the syringe became the symbol of a new kind of power, man's mastery over pain. Doctors injected it for fevers, childbirth, melancholy, even insomnia. Writers and musicians took it for inspiration. What had once been ritual and sin was now science and routine. Patients kept vials beside their bedside crosses. Nurses learned to draw the plunger as gently as prayer. They did not yet understand that each injection was a quiet covenant relief in exchange for allegiance. China, still bruised from foreign wars, watched the new fashion spread across the West with uneasy fascination. Foreign doctors in Shanghai and Hong Kong began introducing the hypodermic needle to their clinics, demonstrating its purity compared to the smoky dens outside. Patients came with trembling hands, seeking a cure for the craving they could not name. The irony was cruel. Morphine was often prescribed to treat opium addiction. Many left cured of the pipe, only to fall deeper into the needle. By 1880, a strange symmetry had emerged. In the East, men still reclined in opium haze beneath bamboo rafters. In the West, women in velvet parlors lifted their sleeves to gleaming syringes. The flower's ghost had crossed oceans, shedding its smoke for liquid, its dens for hospitals, its stigma for science. But the promise was unchanged: freedom from pain, purchased at the cost of dependence. In the war hospitals of Europe, the syringe was as vital as the scalpel. Soldiers returned from battle not only scarred, but tethered to the needle that had saved them. Many could no longer sleep without it. Newspapers called it the soldier's disease. Doctors debated morality while prescribing refills. Empires that had once sold opium to others were now importing it for themselves. By century's end, addiction had learned to hide in plain sight in hospitals, pharmacies, and polite conversation. The smoke had become liquid, the pipe a syringe, the ceremony a procedure. Humanity had refined its weakness into an art form. The poppy's bloom had entered the bloodstream, and the empire it ruled was no longer foreign. It was everywhere. London, 1865. The fog rolled in thick from the Thames, swallowing gas lamps and echoing carriage wheels in the streets. Behind the curtains of Mayfair and Kensington, the empire's heart pulsed with quiet dependence. Bottles lined the shelves of every respectable home, glass vials filled with amber liquid labeled laudanum. It was medicine, they said, a tonic for coughs, nerves, sleeplessness, grief. Its main ingredient, opium, dissolved in alcohol and sweetened with deceit. Victorian England prided itself on its refinement, its civility, its composure. But behind every drawing-room smile there was a tremor. Doctors prescribed laudanum for almost everything: gout, menstrual cramps, hysteria, melancholy. It dulled sorrow as easily as it softened pain. The Queen herself was said to take a tincture for her headaches and grief, the same grief that had once paralyzed the nation after Prince Albert's death. If even the crown needed the poppy's comfort, who could resist it? In apothecaries, clerks dispensed the drug in polished bottles, their labels printed with Latin elegance. No license required. Housewives added a few drops to soothe colicky infants. Factory workers took it to quiet the aches of long labor. Poets and painters drank it to court inspiration, to glimpse what they called the edges of the divine. Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater had made the vice sound almost holy. He wrote of visions that shimmered beyond time and suffering. What he did not write was the loneliness of the mornings after, when the city itself seemed to ache in withdrawal. By night, London glowed with a feverish brilliance. The gaslight shimmered off wet cobblestones, and the fog hid what the world preferred not to see. In the slums of Whitechapel, addicts bought laudanum by the spoonful, their eyes hollow, their bodies frail. They called it the poor man's comfort. In the West End, crystal decanters of the same liquid sat beside cut-glass brandy bottles, sipped by those who ruled colonies in faraway lands. The same poppy that enslaved Bengal now lulled its conquerors to sleep. Pharmacies flourished. The chemists of the empire found new ways to distill the drug, to refine its bitterness, to market it as elegance. Advertisements filled the papers: soothing syrup for infants, Dr. Godfrey's cordial, the gentleman's relief. The empire of the needle had grown an empire of bottles. Yet behind the velvet curtains and the perfumed salons, another kind of decay began to spread. Families grew quieter, letters from artists and scholars turned erratic, desperate. The poppy's peace dulled not only pain but purpose. The poets who wrote of paradise found themselves unable to rise from bed. The housewives who slept dreamless slept too long. By the close of the century, the city that had once sold sleep to the world was itself nodding off. The empire's nerve had been softened by its own medicine. The fog over London no longer hid the addiction, it mirrored it. The Queen's painkiller had become her people's lullaby, and under its spell, the mightiest empire on earth began, quietly, to dream. The 19th century ended as if the world itself were exhaling. Factories roared, cities bloomed, and the streets pulsed with invention. Yet beneath that noise, another rhythm beat slower, softer, like a heartbeat fading under velvet. Opium, once confined to medicine and trade, had become the muse of a generation. It drifted through London's garrets and Parisian cafes, through the hands of poets, painters, and philosophers who believed they could outthink the curse that had conquered empires. They called it inspiration. It was really anesthesia. In a candlelit room on the Strand, Thomas de Quincey wrote of the celestial drug, his words shimmering with reverence and regret. He had opened a door that countless others would walk through: Coleridge, Baudelaire, Poe, Wilde, each searching for the same ghostly vision that hovered between genius and oblivion. They believed the poppy could unlock the divine, loosen the chains of reason, and let the soul speak in color. And for a while, it did. Opium made the ordinary radiant, the pain of life poetic. The first inhale brought calm, the second, ecstasy. But the morning always arrived, and with it, the slow collapse of everything real. In the cafes of Montmartre, the smoke hung thick as perfume. Painters with hollow eyes debated God and beauty while slipping opium pellets beneath their tongues. They spoke of art as salvation and the body as a mere inconvenience. The absinthe green and the poppy brown mingled in their veins until even the clocks seemed to tick in rhythm with their decline. Paris began to dream, and its dreams were painted in oil and despair. Across the Atlantic, Edgar Allan Poe wrote by the flicker of a dying lamp, his hands trembling. The poppy soothed his grief and sharpened his nightmares. His visions of ravens, premature burials, and haunted chambers were not mere stories. They were the residue of a drug that blurred the line between life and decay. He died as so many of his kind would, alone, delirious. The dream turned back upon him. Even the critics could not resist romanticizing the sickness. They called it the price of genius. Addiction became aesthetic, its victims transformed into martyrs of creativity. Every laudanum bottle on a poet's desk became a relic, every verse a confession written in vapor. But beneath the glamour, the truth was simple. Opium did not grant vision, it borrowed it, and then forgot to return it. By the dawn of the 20th century, the artists who once sang of infinity had fallen silent, their pipes cold, their pens still. The age of inspiration had become an age of exhaustion. The poppy had drained not only the body but the imagination itself. The art it inspired glowed briefly, then dimmed, like a candle guttering at the edge of its wax. And somewhere, in the dim light of a forgotten studio, a final wisp of smoke rose from a pipe beside an unfinished canvas. The room was quiet, the air heavy. The artist's last masterpiece was not the painting on the easel, but the silence that followed the silence of one more dreamer who would never wake. The ships left Canton in silence, their holds heavy with memory. By the 1850s, the poppy's empire had crossed the Pacific, carried in the hands of Chinese laborers fleeing famine, war, and hopelessness. They came to California, chasing a new dream: gold in the earth, wages in the railroads, a future untouched by the old world's corruption. But the smoke followed them. It always did. In the shanty towns rising along the western frontier, the smell of opium drifted through the cracks of rough wooden walls. The miners called it the Eastern Sleep. At night, the men who had broken their backs under the sun lay in rows, their pipes glowing faintly in the dark. The drug was not luxury here. It was refuge from loneliness, from violence, from the ache of exile. In the stillness of the camps, the smoke curled upward like a prayer that had forgotten its God. San Francisco grew around them, a city of gold and greed. By the 1870s, Chinatown had become both a marvel and a menace in the eyes of white America, a labyrinth of red lanterns, narrow alleys, and hidden dens. Journalists wrote of it as the city within a city, a place where dreams turned to ashes and men to shadows. The photographs taken there, dim, staged, voyeuristic, captured more than curiosity. They captured fear, fear of the foreign, fear of the familiar weakness reflected back. In the basements along Waverly Place and DuPont Street, opium dens bloomed like a secret industry. Each room was small and dimly lit, lined with narrow bunks and carved wooden pillows. Attendants moved soundlessly, refilling lamps, cleaning pipes, guiding trembling hands back to the ritual. A man would inhale, exhale, and vanish. Outside, the city clamored with ambition and progress, but within those rooms, time forgot itself. The smoke that once symbolized imperial shame now became a tool of scapegoating. Newspapers warned of the yellow peril, of Chinese men seducing white women with the drug's exotic languor. In truth, the dens were rarely more than sanctuaries of the desperate. But hysteria spreads faster than truth. The United States passed its first anti-opium law in 1875, not out of compassion, but prejudice. The government sought to criminalize not the substance, but the people who smoked it. Still, the habit endured. Sailors brought the resin north to Vancouver, south to San Diego, east to Chicago. Every new city built by immigrants carried with it a faint trace of smoke, a whisper of the same longing that had crossed oceans. In a country obsessed with motion, opium became a stillness, the one moment of peace in an age that demanded constant striving. By century's end, the Pacific no longer divided the trade, it connected it. The same waters that carried tea and silk now carried addiction. The world was smaller, and the dream of escape, whether from pain, from empire, or from loneliness, had become a global inheritance. The smoke that once rose from Canton now drifted through the streets of San Francisco, settling softly over a new land that believed itself immune to the past. By the turn of the 20th century, the scent of opium had seeped into the corners of the American dream. Beneath the glitter of electric lights and the hum of the new industrial century, cities like San Francisco, New York, and New Orleans hid a quieter empire, an empire of smoke. In the basements beneath gambling halls and behind the facades of laundries, the dens thrived. They were easy to miss unless you knew what to look for. A single red lamp burning low, a stairwell that disappeared into darkness, a door that never opened to daylight. Inside, the air was thick and slow. Men and women lay side by side on wooden bunks, faces pale beneath the flickering lamplight. The pipes were polished from use, their bowls stained with years of resin. A few words passed between the attendants and the smokers, requests whispered, debts settled, and then silence. The den was a place without clocks. A man could lose an hour or a day. The smoke made no distinction. It curled in the rafters like a memory too soft to die. For many Chinese immigrants, it was the only refuge they had left. Driven west to build railroads and mine gold, then barred from citizenship by the Chinese Exclusion Act, they lived as ghosts in the nation they had helped to shape. Opium gave them something that neither law nor labor could provide: a moment of weightless peace, a reminder that suffering could be postponed, if not forgotten. But the peace of one people became the fear of another. Newspapers printed lurid stories of Chinatown's peril, warning that the dens were snares for the innocent. Illustrations showed white women draped across opium couches, their virtue supposedly stolen by smoke. Politicians saw opportunity in the panic. The city of San Francisco passed the first American anti-opium ordinance in 1875, not against the drug itself. Laudanum and morphine were still freely sold in white pharmacies, but specifically against the Chinese method of smoking it. The law was racial before it was moral. Still, curiosity proved stronger than fear. Artists, sailors, and thrill-seekers descended into the dens, drawn by their mystery. Writers like Jack London and Lafcadio Hearn described the experience with fascination and dread the feeling of slipping beyond the world, of being neither alive nor dead but suspended between. The descriptions were always the same: soft light, slow breath, the sound of a city fading to nothing. By 1900, opium had become America's double life. In the tenements, immigrants inhaled it to survive poverty. In parlors uptown, housewives sipped it to survive despair. Both called it medicine. Neither called it slavery. When the police finally raided the dens, they found no villains, only sleepers. Some woke, blinking and confused. Others did not wake at all. The officers dragged them into the light, coughing and weeping. The air outside suddenly too sharp, too real. The papers called it a victory, but as the smoke cleared, the city looked different, colder, lonelier, as though a piece of its soul had been quietly exhaled. The American dream had learned to dream of nothing at all. The 20th century opened with a promise of progress. Engines roared, cities rose, science gleamed, and yet beneath the polished surface, the oldest craving on earth refused to die. The poppy's shadow had stretched across continents, through pipes and bottles, into every bloodstream it could reach. Now, a new force was stirring in the West, a moral crusade dressed in white collars and conviction. Reformers, ministers, and lawmakers began to speak of cleansing society, of driving out vice, of reclaiming the soul of the modern world. What they really meant was control. The first laws came quietly. In the United States, the 1909 Opium Exclusion Act barred importation of the drug for anything other than medical use. A few years later, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act followed, cloaking prohibition beneath the language of taxation. Doctors could still prescribe morphine and heroin if they registered, if they paid, if they agreed to become gatekeepers for the state. Addiction was no longer a personal weakness, it was a crime. The law did not stop the trade, it merely pushed it underground. In the newspapers, reformers spoke of moral awakening, but the illustrations told a different story. They showed Chinese men in shadowed dens, their pipes extended toward wide-eyed white women, the opium fiend reborn as a racial specter. What had begun as compassion curdled into fear. Anti-drug campaigns fused with xenophobia, and the nation's obsession with purity found its scapegoats. The laws against opium were enforced not in doctors' parlors, but in Chinatown basements. The wealthy continued to sip their laudanum in private. The poor were jailed for chasing the same sleep. Across the ocean, other nations followed suit. Britain, its empire now addicted to its own profits, signed international treaties it had once scorned. In Shanghai, the International Opium Commission met in 1909. Diplomats gathered around polished tables beneath chandeliers. They spoke of reform while outside the conference hall. The streets still smelled faintly of smoke. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The same powers that had fought to flood Asia with opium now vowed to drain it. The poppy, once a tool of empire, had become its embarrassment. But prohibition, like all crusades, bred hypocrisy. In the hospitals, soldiers of the Great War were given morphine for their wounds, then returned home to be called addicts. In the pharmacies, new synthetic opioids were sold under different names, advertised as safe codeine, heroin, de-lauded each one, promising purity and delivering the same hunger. Humanity had outlawed its own reflection, yet continued to stare into the mirror. By the 1922nd, the United States had declared war on two substances at once, alcohol and opium, and lost both battles before they began. The bootlegger and the peddler became America's new kings, their empires built on contradiction. The law could criminalize the body, but it could not legislate the soul. And in the dark corners of every city, the poppy bloomed again, quietly, defiantly. as if to remind the modern world that progress and addiction had always shared the same root. The laboratories of Europe hummed like hives at the dawn of the 20th century. Glass flasks clinked, burners hissed, and white-coated men with steady hands dreamed of conquering pain once and for all. The age of empire had given way to the age of chemistry, and the old poppy was their blueprint. If nature could create such power, the scientists reasoned, then man could surely perfect it. In their pursuit of purity, they built a new Pandora's box and opened it willingly. In 1874, in a small London lab, an English chemist named C.R. Alderwright boiled morphine with acetic anhydride and created something stronger, smoother, and more seductive. It dulled pain faster, promised no addiction, and left no trace of bitterness on the tongue. 2 decades later, the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer would market it to the world under a name meant to inspire heroin. They sold it in elegant brown bottles, embossed with gold lettering. A non-addictive substitute for morphine. Mothers fed it to coughing children. Doctors prescribed it for everything from insomnia to shyness. The world believed them. The chemists did not see poison. They saw perfection, pain, relief without sin, comfort without consequence. But the flower cannot be refined without carrying its shadow. In hospitals and homes, patients began to crave their medicine more often. A few drops turning into spoonfuls, the spoonfuls into silence. By the time doctors realized their miracle drug had inherited the curse of its ancestor, the syringe had already become a household tool. The world had learned to distill its dreams and inject them. Across the Atlantic, American pharmaceutical houses joined the race. Morphine, codeine, laudanum, and heroin were packaged as modern blessings. Advertisements filled newspapers for nervous exhaustion, for hysteria, for the cares of motherhood. Women of every class kept bottles beside their mirrors, their smiles calm and eyes distant. Addiction became invisible, hidden behind the lace and etiquette of progress. The First World War only accelerated the chemistry of dependence. In the trenches of Europe, morphine was as common as bullets. Doctors injected it freely into broken soldiers, their trembling bodies quieting instantly. When the war ended, they returned home heroes but hollow, unable to sleep without the same needle that had once saved them. The soldier's disease, they called it, and no cure followed. Meanwhile, the companies that had built their empires on suffering rebranded their guilt as innovation. The Bayer Cross, once stamped proudly on every bottle of heroin, quietly vanished after the truth became undeniable. Yet by then, the pattern was fixed: discovery, distribution, denial. Each generation of chemists promised a purer drug, each civilization a cleaner conscience. The poppy had entered its next evolution, no longer grown in fields or traded by empires, but synthesized, bottled, and sold in pharmacies that smelled of antiseptic and ambition. Humanity, armed with glass and flame, had finally learned to create its own poison, and it called that poison progress. The guns of the Great War never stopped. From the trenches of France to the deserts of Mesopotamia, the world tore itself apart in mud and wire. The air smelled of cordite and blood, of rot and rain, and through that endless roar of shellfire, one word passed from medic to soldier, whispered like a prayer: morphine. Every soldier carried it. In tin cases stamped with the cross of mercy, small glass ampoules rested beside bandages and bullets. When the body broke, the morphine needle followed a clean puncture, a sigh, a slipping away from agony. It worked instantly. The screams quieted, the eyes unfocused, the trembling hands grew still. Medics learned to measure relief in seconds. Commanders learned to count it in supply lines. The poppy had returned to the battlefield, but now it wore a uniform. By 1916, at the Battle of the Somme, the wounded lay so thick along the trenches that the air itself seemed narcotic. The surgeons worked in canvas tents lit by lanterns, their aprons soaked through with blood and mud. They called morphine the gift from God. It numbed what nothing else could: pain, fear, memory. Soldiers who received too much simply stopped breathing. Those who survived the injection often begged for it again. Relief was no longer a blessing. It was dependence, born in a single instant. When the armistice came, millions returned home alive but hollow. Veterans carried medals on their chests and morphine in their pockets. They had been heroes once, now they were patients. The drug that had saved their limbs had claimed their peace. Doctors called it morphinism, a quiet epidemic that spread through boarding houses and hospital wards, hidden behind drawn curtains. No one wanted to believe that victory itself had been purchased with addiction. Across Europe and America, pharmacies sold vials over the counter. Advertisements offered morphine for nerves, fatigue, and sleeplessness. The veterans who could not live without it were dismissed as weak. The society that had made them so called itself modern. In truth, the world had learned to medicate its conscience. The war had proved that pain could be conquered, but it had also proved that peace could not survive without it. In the poets' cafes of Paris, the survivors wrote of ghosts walking in daylight, of numbness mistaken for calm. They called their generation lost, and in a sense, they were right. The same poppy that had grown in the fields of Flanders now bloomed in their veins. It had been planted there by necessity, watered by grief, harvested by habit. By the time the memorials were built and the statues unveiled, the soldiers had already begun their second war. A quieter one, fought in hospital rooms and lonely flats. There were no medals for that battle, no songs, no honor. Only the slow ticking of time, the sting of the needle, and the fading hope that someday, somehow, the body might remember how to feel without pain again. When the cannons of Europe finally fell silent, America began to hum. The 20s roared with brass and trumpet, with flappers spinning through smoke-filled rooms, with the pulse of a country convinced it had outrun death. But even in celebration, something darker lingered under the rhythm. The soldiers had returned home with shaking hands and restless dreams, and the cure they brought back with them, the same morphine that had eased their wounds, now whispered through the back alleys of Chicago and New Orleans. The war had ended, but the needle had stayed. In the clubs of Storyville, the music throbbed like a heartbeat refusing to slow. Jazz was rebellion and release wild, improvised, alive. But for many of its players, the sound came from pain as much as joy. Heroin, the chemist's dream turned plague, slid quietly into the rhythm section. Trumpeters, pianists, drummers, men who could make an audience rise to its feet, found that the same energy they poured into their instruments could be drawn from a vial. The needle steadied the hand, softened the nerves, stretched time until the music itself seemed infinite. They called it the stuff, the horse, the white lady. It traveled in cigarette papers and glassine envelopes, tucked inside cases beside reeds and brass. It was the poppy's most refined disguise, a ghost too clean for suspicion. Dealers sold it from street corners and speakeasies, where whiskey flowed behind hidden doors and jazz melted into dawn. The musicians swore it made them play better, listen deeper. Maybe it did for a while. Then the notes began to slow, the nights grew longer, and the music turned mournful. Outside the clubs, America was changing fast. Prohibition had outlawed alcohol but taught the nation to love its own defiance. Bootleggers built empires, addicts built habits. The federal government, desperate to prove control, launched its first real war on drugs. But every raid only drove the trade deeper, underground, where the profits grew and the purity worsened. Heroin had found a home in the country's bloodstream, and like jazz itself, it refused to obey the rules. In Harlem, the Renaissance glowed briefly, a burst of color and intellect that redefined a culture. But in the same streets where Langston Hughes wrote of hope, addicts nodded in the shadows of brownstones, chasing their own version of escape. The irony was sharp. A generation seeking freedom through art found itself shackled by the same chemistry that promised release. By the time the Great Depression arrived, the trumpet wails had turned to laments. Heroin was no longer the vice of artists alone. It had crept into alleys, prisons, and homes. The nation that danced to forget was beginning to remember the cost. Jazz still played on wild, luminous, alive, but behind every note was the echo of a heartbeat slowing, a pulse syncopated by sorrow. The music of liberation had become the soundtrack of a quieter captivity. By the time the 20th century reached its midpoint, China, the land where the flower had once been medicine, then plague, then battlefield, had fractured into smoke and ambition. The old empire had fallen, replaced by warlords who carved the nation like a feast, each claiming a province, a title, and the right to profit from the only crop that never failed, the poppy. Its pale blooms swayed across Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou like fields of surrender, their resin traded for rifles, their fragrance masking the rot of a country at war with itself. The generals called it strategy. Opium, they argued, was revenue. Taxes from the trade bought bullets, paid soldiers, kept revolts at bay. In a nation where famine was common and loyalty fleeting, the poppy was more reliable than patriotism. Each faction, nationalist, provincial, communist, condemned the drug in speeches, then trafficked it in secret. The revolution was funded by addiction. Along the Burmese frontier, caravans of mules wound through mountain passes, their packs heavy with bricks of resin wrapped in waxed paper and stamped with dragons or tigers, symbols of the warlords who owned them. The air in the valleys smelled faintly of earth and sugar. By the time the cargo reached Shanghai, it smelled of money. The city's nightclubs and casinos burned with foreign neon, their tables lined with Western businessmen and Chinese elites, inhaling the same smoke that had once brought the empire to its knees. The gang lords of Shanghai, men like Du Yuesheng of the Green Gang, built empires on that trade. Their dens glimmered with chandeliers, their pipes carved from ivory. Politicians courted them, generals needed them, and priests prayed for their souls. The city's opium revenues dwarfed its taxes, its addicts numbered in the millions. The government outlawed opium by day and accepted bribes by night. Shanghai, jewel of the East, had become a chandelier swaying from a rotting beam. Foreign powers, too, found their share in the business. Japanese agents smuggled morphine and heroin into Manchuria, funding their occupation with the very addiction they claimed to despise. Western banks laundered the proceeds through Hong Kong, London, and New York. The war on drugs had become global theater, each nation condemning what it quietly sold. And yet, among the chaos, there were those who tried to fight it. Teachers in small villages burned the pipes of their students. Buddhist monks preached abstinence, calling the poppy the flower of forgetting. A few dared to plant wheat where opium had grown, only to be driven off or killed by the warlords' men. Idealism wilted faster than grain. By the late 1932, China's fields shimmered with the white of poppy blossoms, their beauty almost holy in the twilight. The farmers bowed to harvest them with hands that no longer remembered prayer. Beyond the mountains, the world prepared for another war, one that would make every empire old again. And through it all, the dragon and the poppy endured, feeding each other, waiting for the next master to inhale. When the warlords finally bled themselves dry, a new flag rose over China, red, blue, and white, bright as promise in the morning Sunday. The Republic of China, born from revolution, spoke of rebirth, modernity, and deliverance from the old rot of empire. But the poppy was not so easily banished. Beneath the speeches of unity and progress, its roots still gripped the soil. It had outlived emperors, it would outlive presidents too. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government vowed to end the plague of addiction. He declared opium, the national shame, a relic of foreign exploitation and moral decay. Yet the republic's coffers were empty, its armies scattered, and its enemies communists, bandits, and ghosts of the past everywhere. In the dim rooms of Shanghai and Nanjing, generals and ministers weighed the future of their fragile state against its most reliable revenue. The choice was as bitter as the drug itself. Opium could destroy the nation, yes, but for now, it could also fund it. Officially, the trade was outlawed. Unofficially, it was organized. The nationalists consolidated the smuggling networks under a single government bureau, the Opium Suppression Office, whose task was not to destroy the market, but to control it. Licenses were issued, taxes collected, and warehouses filled. The same drug that had enslaved the empire now kept the Republic alive. For every speech condemning it, another shipment left Yunnan under military escort. Every brick of resin carried a stamp bearing the Republic's seal. Shanghai remained the heart of the hypocrisy. Its skyline glittered with Art Deco towers, its streets pulsed with jazz and ambition, but its foundations were soaked in narcotic profit. The Green Gang, once merely criminal, now walked arm in arm with the ruling party. Gangsters like Du Yuesheng became patriots, financing anti-communist campaigns with opium proceeds. Their dens, once raided, were now guarded. Addiction no longer hid in the shadows. It wore a badge and saluted the flag. Meanwhile, the common people carried the cost. In villages, farmers still grew poppy because the government demanded its tax. In cities, addicts sold heirlooms for another night's oblivion. Families disintegrated quietly behind paper walls, their children left to beg in alleys that smelled faintly of smoke. The new republic, like the old empire, ruled over a kingdom of sleepers, yet not everyone slept. Reformers wrote pamphlets condemning the government's complicity, calling opium the second invasion. They were silenced or bought. A few schools and churches launched rehabilitation programs, trying to save what could be saved. Most failed. By the late 1932, as Japan's armies marched across China's coast, the Republic's officials fled their burning cities, some carrying rifles, others carrying opium bricks. The fields of Yunnan and Sichuan glowed white under the sun, their harvest once again traded for survival. The Republic had promised rebirth. Instead, it inherited the empire's old sickness, dressed in new colors. And as war thundered closer, the poppy kept blooming delicate, untouchable, eternal. The invasion began as a whisper engines over Manchuria, boots on frozen soil, a flag rising where the sun was not supposed to. By the early 1932, Japan had turned China's northern provinces into a puppet state they called Manchukuo. It was meant to be a model of order and progress, a showcase for empire, but beneath its manicured boulevards and banners of modernity, another economy pulsed, one older, darker, and far more profitable. The Japanese occupation revived the opium trade on a scale China had never seen. Tokyo's generals called it pacification. Addiction, they reasoned, was more efficient than war. Where bullets sowed resistance, opium sowed silence. The Kwantung army flooded Manchuria with poppies, converting its plains into fields of pale blossoms that swayed like ghosts in the wind. Laboratories were built beside barracks. Chemists in military uniform refined the resin into morphine and heroin, stamped with government seals. Pharmacies across the new empire sold the drugs as pain relief, but everyone knew their true purpose. The puppet emperor, Puyi, the same boy who had once ruled the Forbidden City, now signed decrees written for him by Japanese officers. His name appeared on anti-opium proclamations by day, while his ministers smuggled shipments by night. The profits paid for railroads, factories, and propaganda. The illusion of prosperity sustained by a population too dazed to protest. Japanese police, charged with suppressing the trade, took their share in bribes and silence. Shanghai, still nominally under Chinese control, became a crossroads of the empire's narcotic web. Japanese firms opened pharmaceutical offices there, shipping heroin to occupied territories and beyond. In return, they imported silver, arms, and influence. The Green Gang and the Japanese military became uneasy partners, crime and conquest bound together by the same powder. Each shipment that left Manchuria carried not just opium, but the quiet erosion of a nation's will. The addicts of the old empire had smoked their ruin in pipes. The new generation injected it with needles, quicker and cleaner. In the streets of Harbin and Mukden, addicts slept in doorways, their veins marked with tiny bruises that no one dared to count. School children walked past them as if they were part of the landscape, fallen leaves that would never rise again. By 1937, as Japan's armies pushed deeper into China, The policy of narcotic control turned into outright warfare by chemistry. Towns that resisted occupation were flooded with heroin, their youth crippled before they could fight. When the soldiers arrived, the city gates opened quietly. No resistance, no flame, only the faint, sickly scent of smoke. When the war finally ended a decade later, the victors spoke of liberation. But in the ruins of Manchuria, the poppy still grew wild in the cracks of the roads. The laboratories lay abandoned, their floors dusted with the residue of years. It was said that the wind blowing across those plains smelled faintly of sugar and decay, the fragrance of a weapon disguised as comfort, of an empire built on the art of forgetting. When the red banners rose over Beijing in 1949, the air itself seemed to tremble with deliverance. The warlords were gone, the foreign soldiers scattered, the old republic dissolved. Mao Zedong stood on the walls of the Forbidden City and declared that China had stood up. Beneath him stretched a nation hollowed by war, famine, and addiction, a country where millions still knelt nightly before the pipe. The revolution would change that, Mao promised. The people would awaken, the poppy would burn. The communist campaign against opium began like a thunderclap. In every village, loudspeakers blared slogans: "Destroy the poison, save the nation." Cadres in plain uniforms arrived carrying clipboards and rifles. They gathered farmers, merchants, addicts, and priests into public squares and read out lists of names. Dealers were labeled enemies of the people. Addicts were sick souls. Both were told redemption lay in struggle or death. The eradication was swift and merciless. In the hills of Yunnan and Sichuan, soldiers marched into the poppy fields at dawn, dousing them in kerosene and setting them alight. The flames rippled across the terraces like red silk, consuming the white blossoms that had ruled China for centuries. Farmers wept as their only livelihood turned to smoke, but tears could not quench ideology. The revolution had no sympathy for history. In the cities, the addicts were rounded up by the tens of thousands. Some were sent to re-education camps, where the cure was labor and shame. Others were made to stand before crowds, confessing their weakness through trembling lips. In some towns, executions followed a bullet through the skull, the crowd applauding righteousness. Families watched fathers disappear and wives vanish, their crimes measured in grams of resin. For the first time in memory, the poppy's rule was truly challenged, not by morality, not by diplomacy, but by terror. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else: relief. Mothers who had buried sons to addiction cheered the soldiers. Teachers who had seen classrooms emptied by hunger welcomed the purges as salvation. In a decade, opium use in China plummeted to almost nothing. The drug that had conquered emperors and corrupted republics seemed at last to have met its match in ideology. But even revolutions have shadows. In the mountains where borders blurred Burma, Laos, Vietnam, displaced farmers fled the flames and took their seeds with them. Under the protection of new militias and old resentments, the poppy bloomed again, beyond the reach of Mao's hand. From those ashes, the Golden Triangle was born, a new frontier for an old hunger. Within China, the people slept clean but uneasy. The smoke had lifted, but so had mercy. The nation had awakened, yes, but not gently. The cure had been as brutal as the disease, and the memory of that cure would linger, like a phantom scent, long after the poppy was gone. Mao had burned the fields, but the dream of forgetting that no ideology could erase. While Mao's new China burned its poppy fields to ash, the West began planting its own, not in soil, but in laboratories and hospitals. The 20th century's great irony unfolded in white coats and sterile corridors. What China had destroyed in fire, Europe and America resurrected through science. Pain, it seemed, was too profitable to let go. In the aftermath of the Second World War, pharmaceutical companies flourished like empires reborn. Morphine had saved soldiers again, and governments were unwilling to abandon the miracle that dulled agony and kept the wounded quiet. The war had taught a new generation of doctors how easily suffering could be managed, how neatly human emotion could be measured in milligrams. By the 1950 seconds, the hypodermic syringe had become the West's most trusted instrument, clean, precise, and unquestioned. Hospitals prescribed opiates not as indulgence but as progress. New painkillers, oxycodone, hydrocodone, methadone, appeared in glossy ads in Time and Life, their names lyrical, their dangers unspoken. For mothers, for workers, for heroes of industry, the slogans said. Pills replaced vials, comfort replaced caution. Addiction, now dressed in prescription labels, wore respectability like a mask. In suburban America, medicine cabinets gleamed. Housewives swallowed capsules for exhaustion, veterans for old injuries, businessmen for sleeplessness. The same compounds once smoked in dens now came in bottles labeled relief. Pharmacies became quiet temples of dependence, and doctors, the new priests. Behind the counter, a century of moral crusades against opium was undone with a signature and a smile. The irony ran deeper still. Western governments that had once condemned China for its moral decay now faced their own epidemic. Morphine and its children codeine, Demerol, D-Laudid flowed through hospitals like holy water. The medical journals wrote of tolerance and withdrawal, but the public preferred comfort to comprehension. A pill for pain, a pill for calm, a pill for everything except the emptiness that followed. By the late 1950 seconds, a darker current began to surface. Addicts no longer fit the caricature of the den-dwelling outcast. They were nurses, teachers, secretaries, men and women, whose habits had been prescribed. The pharmaceutical companies denied blame. These are not opium, they insisted. These are modern. The poppy had simply changed form. Its petals were now paper labels, its fragrance the faint chemical scent of acetone and starch. Across the Atlantic, the needle's empire spread through the veins of Europe. The same laboratories that once created heroin now manufactured methadone to curate a circle so perfect it bordered on poetry. In laboratories from Basel to New Jersey, scientists spoke of a future free from pain, not realizing they were building one dependent on it. And so the cycle turned again. East had purged what West had perfected. The smoke had become liquid, the resin a tablet, the curse a prescription. The poppy no longer needed fields to grow it, bloomed in the bloodstream of the modern world, invisible and indispensable. By the 1960s, the poppy had gone to medical school. Its sap was now science, its priests men in white coats who spoke the language of compassion and progress. Pain had become the enemy of civilization, and doctors its soldiers. In hospital corridors and suburban clinics, a new creed emerged that no patient should suffer, that pain could be measured and erased. The oath was noble, the tools were poison. In gleaming laboratories, pharmaceutical companies refined the flower's legacy into dozens of new forms, Percodan, Vicodin, Darvon, and a dozen others with soft, trustworthy names. Each promised precision, control, relief. Addiction was considered a relic of the past, a symptom of moral failure, not chemistry. The same logic that had justified empire now justified medicine. If pain existed, it could be conquered. If suffering persisted, it was only because the dose was too small. Doctors, overworked and idealistic, prescribed liberally. They saw patients limp into their offices, eyes dull with exhaustion, and left believing they had given them mercy. The little white pills were clean, approved, respectable, a far cry from the pipes and powders of the old world. Yet behind every prescription lay the same deception, relief that deepened the wound. Some physicians noticed too late. They come back again and again, one New York doctor wrote in his journal, not for healing, for escape. The 1970 seconds brought new warnings. Medical journals spoke of dependence syndromes. Hospitals quietly documented rising overdose deaths, but the pharmaceutical giants pressed on, funding research, sponsoring conferences, and printing pamphlets that assured the public their products were safe. Addiction was rebranded as misuse. The needle was gone, The problem, they said, was choice. And the doctors, torn between empathy and denial, found themselves standing where priests and emperors once had, deciding how much suffering a human being should feel. Meanwhile, the world outside the hospitals changed. The Vietnam War produced a new wave of soldiers who returned with syringes in their duffels and nightmares in their sleep. Heroin flowed through the barracks, the same drug that had once numbed their fathers in the trenches of France. The government blamed foreign dealers, but the truth was domestic. The poppy was now everywhere, in pharmacies, in purses, in the bloodstream of every class. A few physicians began to rebel. In rural clinics, some refused to prescribe narcotics at all. Others founded rehabilitation wards, preaching detox as penance. But their efforts were small fires in a cold, wide storm. For every addict who recovered, another 100 quietly began their descent with a doctor's blessing and a pharmacist's smile. By the end of the century, pain management had become an industry unto itself, lucrative, regulated, and lethal. The doctor's hand, once a symbol of mercy, had become the instrument of dependence. Between compassion and commerce, between healing and harm, medicine had made its choice, though it could not yet bear to name it. The war on pain had begun, and the world was already losing. High in the mountains where China, Burma, and Laos meet, mist drifts over valleys like the breath of sleeping gods. The jungle is so dense that sunlight arrives in shards, and every path seems to lead to secrecy. It was here, in the aftermath of Mao's purge, that the poppy found its next home, reborn, exiled, and more dangerous than ever. The world would come to know this place by a name both beautiful and damning: the Golden Triangle. The refugees who fled the burning fields of Yunnan carried little with them: some seed, some soil, and the memory of hunger. They settled in the border highlands, where government maps ended and the law dissolved into fog. The land was poor, but the flower grew rich. Within a few years the hills shimmered white with blossoms. Local militias, desperate for funding, taxed the harvest. Generals, smugglers, and spies bought their loyalty with bullets and gold. In a world divided by ideology, opium became the one currency everyone accepted. During the 1950 seconds and 60 seconds, the Cold War turned the region into a shadow theater. While great powers preached freedom or revolution, both quietly relied on the trade that funded their allies. The Kuomintang remnant soldiers who had fled Mao's armies built their armies in these hills, selling opium to finance their endless counter-revolution. American intelligence, desperate to contain communism, turned a blind eye. Airstrips carved from jungle soil became lifelines for both weapons and drugs. From the mountain villages, the poppy resin traveled in caravans, mule trains, winding through ravines, guarded by men with rifles older than themselves. The resin was pressed into bricks stamped with dragons or peacocks, symbols of invisible kingdoms. By the time it reached the ports of Rangoon or Bangkok, it had changed hands a dozen times and tripled in price. The buyers were not farmers or soldiers anymore. They were syndicates, politicians, and brokers who lived in mansions far from the smell of sap. In Bangkok's alleys, laboratories emerged, small and precise, where chemists cooked heroin from the raw resin in vats of acid. The product was pure, white, deadly, a powder that would soon flood Saigon, Hong Kong, and eventually the streets of New York. The war in Vietnam ensured its spread. Soldiers on both sides found solace in the same dust. For every bomb dropped from the sky, another packet crossed the border below. The Golden Triangle became the world's beating heart of narcotics, producing more than half the planet's opium by the 1970 seconds. Its jungles hid both beauty and damnation. Hill tribes cultivating survival, generals enriching empires, governments pretending blindness. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, their slopes glowing under the moon like fields of bone. For centuries, the poppy had moved wherever power and pain intersected. Here, amid mist and gunfire, it found perfect balance, a world too fractured to unite, too desperate to quit. The armies came and went, the ideologies rose and fell, but the flower remained, whispering softly to the soil. nothing end. By the early 1970s, the world's veins had connected. From the misted hills of the Golden Triangle to the neon glow of Manhattan, heroin flowed like an invisible river, pure, potent, and unstoppable. The same poppies that bloomed in Burmese valleys now haunted the alleys of Saigon, Paris, and New York. Soldiers carried it in their kits, dealers carried it in their veins. Governments called it a crisis, but none could admit they had helped build it. The Vietnam War became the artery through which the trade pulsed. American troops, weary and disillusioned, found solace in the same white powder that locals smoked in bamboo pipes. Dealers sold it near bases for pocket change, knowing the demand was endless. By 1971, reports claimed that nearly 1 in 5 U.S. servicemen in Southeast Asia was addicted. The irony was cruel. The soldiers who had come to fight communism were now prisoners of chemistry. Their discipline dissolved into dreams. From Thailand and Laos, the drug traveled north by air and sea, hidden in rice sacks, tea tins, and diplomatic pouches. Syndicates in Hong Kong refined the product further, turning crude resin into crystalline heroin with a purity the world had never seen. It was nicknamed China White, and it hit the streets of America like a phantom, odorless, smokeless, invisible, until it was too late. The addicts of Harlem and the Bronx called it the ghost. It didn't burn. It vanished. The city changed with it. In the narrow stairwells of New York tenements, needles littered the floor like fallen pins of some grim devotion. Young men nodded on park benches, their arms banded with belts, their heads heavy with the same dream that had seduced emperors. Police raided apartments and warehouses, hauling out burlap bags filled with powder that looked harmless as flour. The mayor declared war on heroin, but wars waged on appetite are wars that never end. Across the ocean, Europe faced its own reckoning. In Paris, the ghost moved through the cafes where poets once sought inspiration. In London, it slithered through the music scene, claiming guitarists and singers who mistook numbness for art. From Harlem to Hamburg, addiction became the silent epidemic of the post-war world, one without ideology, without borders, without cure. Meanwhile, in Washington, politicians gave speeches about law and morality, while their agencies quietly used the same drug trade to finance covert operations abroad. Intelligence officers justified it as strategic necessity. In truth, the heroin highway was too valuable to close. The enemy had changed, but the profit remained the same. By the end of the decade, a new generation had grown up in the shadow of the poppy, not as colonists or soldiers, but as consumers. The old empires had crumbled, but their invention endured. A commodity that crossed every ocean, answered every hunger, and demanded only one sacrifice: the will to remember. The roads of empire had been paved again, this time not with stone, but with veins. In June of 1971, President Richard Nixon stepped before the cameras, his voice grave, his posture rehearsed. "America," he declared, "has a new enemy. The war on drugs has begun." Behind him, the map of the world looked like a wound. In the name of salvation, the same nation that once trafficked opium through empires now promised to eradicate it. But the enemy was not across the sea anymore. It was in the bloodstream of its own citizens. Billions were poured into enforcement. Task forces, helicopters, narcotics divisions, a modern crusade of badges and guns. Addicts were rounded up like criminals, their sickness rebranded as sin. Methadone clinics opened beside courthouses, offering redemption in doses measured by state approval. The needle that had once been medicine was now evidence. The pharmacist's vial, contraband. Yet for every arrest, 10 new users appeared. The poppy had adapted faster than the policy. In New York, heroin still ruled the night. Harlem's brownstones echoed with the clink of spoons, the hiss of lighters, the sighs of those too tired to care. The Bronx burned not from bombs or ideology, but from neglect and addiction. Newspapers showed photographs of children stepping over bodies on their way to school. To the public, these images became symbols of urban decay. To the addicts, they were mirrors. The government blamed foreign cartels, but the rot was domestic. In Appalachia and the Midwest, prescription opioids flowed unchecked through rural clinics, their manufacturers protected by profit and denial. The farmers who had once grown poppy under the sun now swallowed its chemical twin under fluorescent light. Every era found its own delivery system. Meanwhile, the war on drugs spread beyond America. In Mexico, in Thailand, in Turkey, entire regions were militarized in the name of eradication. Farmers who had little else were told to burn their fields or face prison. When the soldiers left, hunger remained, and hunger always replants what fear destroys. The black markets flourished, the drug routes twisted and multiplied, feeding the same demand the speeches could not silence. By the 1980 seconds, the campaign had turned inward again. Prisons filled faster than rehabs. The addicts were no longer patients or victims, they were statistics. Their lives tallied in funding proposals and political victories. The poor, the brown, the desperate, they bore the brunt of righteousness masquerading as order. Meanwhile, new designer opioids slipped through the same legal cracks the old ones had crawled from. It was a carousel of chemistry and hypocrisy, spinning faster each year. The war on drugs had become a war on itself, a machine devouring its own justification. The flower that once built empires had now built industries. Prisons, police forces, pharmaceuticals. Every syringe confiscated was another produced. Every addict imprisoned was another created. By the end of the century, Nixon's crusade had outlived him, swollen into bureaucracy. The war had no victory, no peace treaty, no end, only echoes of the same contradiction that began millennia ago. Humanity was still chasing the same illusion, that pain could be defeated without understanding it, and that forgetting could ever be freedom. By the time the millennium neared, the war on drugs had shifted from the streets back into the doctor's office. After decades of criminalizing addiction, America began to listen to a softer voice, one that promised compassion through chemistry. Pain, the new prophet said, was undertreated, misunderstood, a moral failing of medicine itself. No one, the pharmaceutical pamphlets declared, should live in pain. And so began another revolution, not with guns or poppy fields, but with prescriptions. It started innocently enough. Doctors, once wary of narcotics, were retrained to see pain as the fifth vital sign. Hospitals introduced smiley face charts, asking patients to rate their suffering. The drug companies were ready with answers. In 1996, Purdue Pharma released a new painkiller, sleekly packaged and aggressively marketed, OxyContin. Its makers promised it was different, modern, precise, and non-addictive when used correctly. Sales representatives toured the country handing out pens, pamphlets, and samples, while data sheets whispered reassurance. The poppy had never worn such a clean disguise. Doctors, pressed for time and drowning in patience, reached for the pill. It was easier than therapy, faster than empathy. One prescription became 10, 10 became 1,000. Rural clinics began to resemble dispensaries, their waiting rooms filled with miners, veterans, and mothers whose backs, knees, and hearts all ached in ways no scan could measure. The pills worked at first. Pain faded, sleep returned, and life felt manageable. But dependence arrived quietly, in smaller doses than anyone expected. Soon, the stories began. A teacher found slumped at her desk, a factory worker collapsing in the bathroom, a teenager raiding a parent's medicine cabinet. Pharmacies in small towns moved more pills per month than entire cities. When the government finally investigated, it found rivers of OxyContin flowing into communities where poverty had already made every day a wound. The company's internal memos told a simpler story. Repeat customers are profitable. By the early 2000s, overdoses had become funerals, and prescriptions had become prayers. Those cut off by new regulations turned to heroin, cheaper and easier to find. The transition was seamless, a circle unbroken since Mesopotamia. The flower had changed form again, but not purpose. It was still the promise of peace, packaged for a modern market. The pain epidemic was not a disease, it was a mirror. It reflected everything humanity had refused to confront: loneliness, labor, loss. A culture built on motion could not bear stillness, so it medicated its restlessness. In chasing comfort, it found dependence. By the end of the decade, entire towns in Appalachia were hollowed out, their main streets lined with boarded pharmacies and silent churches. The same country that once fought opium wars abroad now waged one within its own borders against itself, its doctors, its despair. The opium of empire had become the medicine of democracy. The poppy no longer needed an enemy. It had found a home in pain. By the second decade of the 21st century, America had become a nation of mourners. The numbers were abstract at first: graphs in newspapers, charts in hearings, but behind every line was a kitchen table with an empty chair. The overdose crisis no longer belonged to the shadows. It had moved into the daylight, into suburbs and small towns, where grief was now a household word. The body count was no longer a statistic, it was a mirror. Funeral homes filled faster than hospitals could discharge. Entire counties in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky reported more deaths from overdoses than from car crashes or cancer. Police carried not guns but syringes of naloxone, the drug that could snatch a person back from the edge of the void, at least for a while. In one town, a single paramedic revived the same man 3 times in a week. "He said thank you," she told a reporter, "and I knew I'd see him again." The culprits wore suits, not masks. The same pharmaceutical companies that had preached relief and safety now faced lawsuits and protests. Documents leaked from courtrooms revealed the truth. They had known that patience built tolerance, that addiction bloomed in silence, that the profits soared with every refill. Emails spoke of market opportunities in the poorest zip codes, of potential growth in high-risk populations. The victims were not statistics, they were strategy. The addicts came from every direction: factory workers laid off from jobs that no longer existed, soldiers returned from wars that never ended, mothers nursing invisible wounds. Many began with prescriptions written in trust, pills taken as directed until the direction vanished. When the bottle emptied, the street filled the gap. Dealers sold heroin cheaper than pharmacy copays, often cut with a new substance called fentanyl, a synthetic opiate, 50 times stronger than morphine. It was invisible, tasteless, merciless, a speck too small to see, could stop a heart before the song on the radio finished playing. Communities tried to fight back. Churches opened recovery groups. Libraries stocked overdose kits beside the shelves of fiction. Judges ordered treatment instead of prison. Yet the wave kept coming, tidal, relentless, faceless. Every success story was followed by relapse, every rescue by another death. Hope became a revolving door. The government declared a public health emergency, but the policies that followed were slow and tangled. The drug companies issued statements of regret, their executives testifying with practiced sorrow. "We never intended this outcome," they said, as if intention could absolve history. The stock prices dipped, then rose again. By 2019, more Americans had died from opioids than in all US wars since Vietnam combined. And still the pills moved, still the powder crossed borders, still the grief multiplied quietly from house to house. The empire of pain had outlived its founders, its enemies, and its excuses. The poppy's harvest had come full circle, and this time the reaping was measured not in profit, but in ghosts. By the time the new decade dawned, the world's most powerful drug no longer grew in soil. It was born in laboratories, cooked in steel and glass by chemists who needed no fields, no sunlight, no farmers, only formulas. Fentanyl, first synthesized in a Belgian lab in the 1960 seconds as a surgical anesthetic, had escaped its sterile origins. It was no longer medicine. It was an algorithm of death, engineered for efficiency. Unlike the poppy, fentanyl required no harvest, no season, no empire. A few kilograms of precursor chemicals, most shipped legally from factories in China, later from Mexico, could yield millions of doses. It was easier to smuggle than heroin, stronger than morphine by orders of magnitude, and nearly impossible to detect. Traffickers diluted it with talcum powder, sugar, or counterfeit pills stamped to look like OxyContin or Xanax. The difference between a high and a corpse was measured in milligrams, the weight of a snowflake. The flood came quietly. At first, law enforcement thought they were still chasing heroin, but the overdose scenes told a different story. Victims were found with syringes still in their arms, blue lips, pupils pinpricked to nothing. Some had taken a single pill, unaware it was laced with something stronger than their bodies could comprehend. Paramedics who touched the residue with bare hands collapsed beside the victims they tried to save. The line between user and rescuer blurred. In Mexico, cartels adapted faster than governments. The Sinaloa and Jalisco networks abandoned poppy fields for chemistry labs hidden among avocado groves and industrial parks. There, masked workers mixed fentanyl precursors under the glare of fluorescent bulbs. No rain could ruin the crop. No soldier could burn it. A single shipment the size of a backpack could supply an entire city's addiction for months. When one lab fell, 2 more rose. In America, counterfeit pills spread through high schools and suburbs, disguised as safety. Teenagers swallowed what they thought were prescription painkillers, unaware they were taking death in micrograms. News anchors spoke of poisoning rather than overdose, a semantic mercy that made the epidemic sound accidental. But the truth was systemic. Demand met supply with mathematical precision. Meanwhile, on the dark web, dealers operated with anonymity once reserved for ghosts. Bitcoin replaced cash. Postal workers became unwitting couriers. Packages the size of envelopes carried the power to wipe out neighborhoods. Customs agents seized tons, yet for every ounce intercepted, 100 more slipped through. The morgues overflowed. Cities built refrigerated trucks to store bodies. Rural towns held candlelight vigils in school gyms. The bleachers lined with photographs of sons and daughters who would never come home. The drug had no smell, no color, no myth, only numbers. It was the poppy stripped of poetry, the end of the long illusion that addiction needed beauty to destroy. The synthetic flood had washed away even memory. No empire ruled it, no god blessed it. It was pure chemistry, now grief refined to its most potent form, humming through the veins of a civilization that had perfected its own undoing. By the 2020s, the world had grown quiet in strange ways. Streets, once filled with the pulse of ambition, now echoed with absence, jobs lost, towns hollowed, families broken by a grief too ordinary to name. Addiction no longer lived in the margins. It was the background noise of an age too exhausted to care. The opioid crisis had ceased to be a crisis. It had become routine. The pandemic years only deepened the silence. Isolation spread faster than any virus, and with it came the search for numbness. Pharmacies were deemed essential, and for millions, that meant survival. Lockdowns blurred the line between medication and escape. Prescriptions renewed automatically, dealers delivering door-to-door, the infrastructure of dependence humming along even as the world stopped moving. When the first waves of fentanyl overdoses hit during the pandemic, the deaths were described as secondary casualties. In truth, they were parallel ones. The statistics arrived like weather reports. 100,000 dead in a year, then more, each figure so large it lost meaning. Reporters spoke of opioid deaths the way they once spoke of natural disasters, as if the storm were no one's fault. But behind every number was the same pattern: an ache, a pill, a tolerance, a fall. People weren't chasing euphoria anymore, they were chasing normalcy, a way to feel nothing without dying. Governments responded with slogans: "End the epidemic," "Choose recovery." Billboards rose over highways once lined with tobacco ads. But the system that had built the catastrophe could not dismantle it. Pharmaceutical giants paid fines that barely dented their profits. Politicians promised compassionate solutions while funding more prisons than clinics. Doctors prescribed substitutes, methadone, Suboxone treatments that saved lives but rarely restored them. The war on pain had simply evolved into its next stalemate. In the cities, Narcan became as common as fire extinguishers. Police officers carried it in their belts, teachers in their desks, parents in their glove compartments. Whole communities learned to revive the dead without ever stopping the dying. Some neighborhoods grew used to the sirens, to the sound of ambulances coming and going like clockwork. "We're getting good at resuscitating," one nurse said, "but not at living." Meanwhile, art tried to make sense of the numbness. Films, songs, poems, all spoke of fatigue, of disconnection, of a generation inheriting a world where the pursuit of comfort had turned into its opposite. The opiate dream that began in ancient temples and colonial ships had finally found its truest form, a global trance. The 21st century was not an empire of conquest but of sedation. Humanity had learned to engineer its own forgetfulness, to replace prayer with dosage, sorrow with chemistry. The flower had fulfilled its destiny to soothe, to bind, to erase, and as the century nodded forward, half awake and half alive, it carried the same illusion as ever, that peace, if it cannot be found, can at least be M. The poppy no longer needed a name. It had become an idea, a rhythm beneath civilization's heartbeat, steady, seductive, and enduring. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the neon morgues of modern America, its promise had remained unchanged. Sleep and forget. Humanity had tried every possible cure: religion, empire, war, science, and each had led it back to the same sweet surrender. The drug had outlasted its creators, its merchants, its kings. It had become history's shadow, following quietly wherever pain was found. In the early 21st century, addiction no longer shocked, it simply existed. Rehab clinics lined the highways like rest stops. Cities hosted Overdose Awareness Day, vigils each August, where candles flickered against the same darkness that had never lifted. Parents stood shoulder to shoulder, holding photographs that all looked alike, young faces frozen in light, smiles that would never age. It was not rage that filled these gatherings anymore, but weary recognition. The fight had become generational, the grief hereditary. Even the scientists, who once promised solutions, began to sound like historians. They traced new drugs through genetic data, through brain scans and chemistry, yet all paths led backward. The receptors that made humans crave opiates were older than writing, older than civilization itself. The body had always been ready for the poppy. The poppy had simply been waiting to be found. The addiction was not an invasion, it was an inheritance. Governments still waged their wars, burning crops in Afghanistan, raiding labs in Mexico, banning fentanyl precursors, but the poppy had long since escaped the earth. It thrived in the circuitry of supply chains, in online pharmacies, in algorithms that could deliver despair faster than compassion. No fire could cleanse what was no longer physical. The battle had moved inside, into the brain, into the soul, into the very idea of relief. Yet amid the ruins, there were glimmers of defiance. Harm reduction centers replaced punishment with mercy. Addicts helped each other survive, sharing clean needles, safe spaces, and stories that sounded like scripture rewritten in pain. Some found recovery not in abstinence, but in the fragile courage of endurance, learning to live with pain rather than erase it. In that choice, perhaps, lay the faintest rebellion against the poppy's dominion, and still the dream went on. The poppy's breath lingered in every culture's language to take the edge off, to unwind, to rest easy. Humanity no longer needed fields or flowers, it had learned to cultivate oblivion in its mind. The drug was no longer foreign or forbidden, it was familiar, domestic, and quietly divine. History had not ended in catastrophe, but in drowsiness. Empires had risen and fallen beneath the same fog, and still the dream endured, too old to die, too comforting to refuse. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of the poppy. Not destruction, not salvation, but sleep deep, seductive, and without end.